My name is Morgan Hale. I'm 35 years old, and I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. If you met me through work, you would probably describe me as quiet, organized, maybe a little too serious. I pay bills early. I make lists before grocery shopping. I hate being late, and I still check the stove twice before leaving my apartment. Nothing about my life is particularly chaotic, but if you asked my family, you would hear about a completely different woman. They would tell you I had always been difficult. My mother, Diane, preferred softer words when other people were listening. She would tilt her head and say, "Morgan feels things very deeply." It sounded loving. It wasn't. In private, the language was clearer. I was jealous, dramatic, controlling, bitter. Celeste was 3 years younger than me, and somehow every quality that made me difficult made her special. If I wanted to be alone, I was punishing everyone. If Celeste wanted to be alone, she needed space. If I questioned something, I was argumentative. If Celeste questioned something, she was curious. If I remembered an event differently, I was rewriting history. If Celeste remembered it differently, then I must have misunderstood. My father, Russell, rarely joined those conversations. For years, I thought that made him the safer parent. It took me a long time to understand that silence can choose a side. My mother would accuse me of something, and I would look at him. "Dad?" He would stare at the television or study whatever was on his plate. "Just let it go, Morgan." That was his answer to almost everything. Let it go. Be the older sister. Stop making things worse. Eventually, I understood the family rule. Celeste could create a problem, but my reaction to the problem would always be treated as the real offense. I moved to Charlotte because I wanted distance without declaring war. I kept my own apartment, built my career, and limited family visits to holidays and occasional weekends. I never officially cut anyone off. Some part of me kept thinking that if I became calm enough, successful enough, and predictable enough, the story about me would eventually collapse from lack of evidence. I was wrong. Celeste simply learned to tell it better. By her early 30s, my little sister had become the founder of Clear Harbor Collective, a growing wellness company built around boundaries, emotional healing, and surviving toxic family systems. I found out about her first major speaking event because a former college roommate sent me a clip. "Morgan," she wrote, "is she talking about you?" I watched 17 seconds. Celeste stood on a softly lit stage in a white suit, speaking to a room full of women. She never said my name. She didn't need to. She talked about growing up beside someone who resented her happiness, someone who needed control, someone whose anger made the whole family afraid. Then she smiled sadly and said, healing began when she stopped apologizing for protecting herself. The audience applauded. I closed the video. I didn't call Celeste. I didn't call my mother. I went into my kitchen, made coffee, and stood by the window until it got cold. There was a time when I would have tried to correct the story. I would have written long messages. I would have collected dates in my head and rehearsed explanations before family dinners. I stopped doing that years ago. Arguments disappear, records don't. At the back of my bedroom closet, behind 2 folded blankets and an old suitcase, I kept a blue metal tin. It wasn't locked. It didn't need to be. Celeste had never been inside my Charlotte apartment, and my parents had visited only once. To anyone else, the tin looked ordinary. The paint was scratched around one corner, and the lid had a shallow dent near the edge. I had owned it since I was 13. Sometimes I went months without touching it. Other times, something would happen. A strange message, a family accusation, a story that changed between one phone call and the next. And I would add something. A printed email, a photocopy, a dated note, a screenshot. Then I would close the lid and return it to the shelf. I never told my family I kept records. They believed I was the emotional one, the unreliable one, the woman who remembered things incorrectly. That belief had protected Celeste for most of our lives. Now she was selling it. Clear Harbor grew quickly. Retreats, coaching programs, certification courses, podcasts, conference appearances. My mother shared every announcement, so proud of our brave girl, she wrote beneath one photograph. I stared at those words longer than I should have. Our brave girl. I wondered what that made me. Then I closed the app and went back to work. By then, I was tired of defending myself against things that hadn't happened yet. Tired of entering family conversations already preparing an appeal. Tired of believing one perfect explanation might finally make my parents look at me and say they had been wrong. I had spent years waiting for that moment. It never came. What I had instead was a quiet apartment in Charlotte, a life my family barely understood, and a blue metal tin sitting in the dark. At that point, I still thought the things inside it belonged to the past. I didn't know my sister was about to make them relevant again. And I didn't know that the story my family had invented about me was no longer just a family lie. It had become an asset, a business model, and eventually, a weapon. My grandparents, Margaret and Henry, were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary that October. They lived in an old 2-story house in Savannah with pale green shutters and a porch that wrapped around one side. Margaret loved that house. She knew every loose floorboard and every cabinet hinge that needed oil. About 30 relatives and family friends came to the party. I remember the dining room table covered with framed photographs from my grandparents' marriage. Celeste spent most of the afternoon moving between adults, accepting compliments about her dress and offering to help carry plates. I stayed near the back porch. At 13, I was already learning that the safest place at a family gathering was somewhere nobody needed anything from me. Margaret found me there before lunch. "You hiding?" "Maybe," she smiled. "Smart girl." That was Margaret. She could say something simple without turning it into a judgment. Pinned to her navy dress was a sapphire brooch surrounded by tiny diamonds. I had seen it before, but never up close. She noticed me looking at it and touched it lightly. "My mother gave me this." "It's pretty. It's old," she said. "Sometimes those are the same thing." She laughed and went back inside. That was the only conversation I had about the brooch that day. About an hour later, Margaret changed clothes because one of the younger cousins spilled punch on her dress. She left the brooch in the small jewelry box upstairs. 20 minutes later, it was gone. I didn't know anything had happened until I walked into the dining room and realized everyone had stopped talking. Margaret stood near the stairs. Diane was beside her. Russell had one hand in his pocket. Celeste was sitting on the edge of a chair. "What happened?" I asked. My mother looked at me. "Your grandmother can't find something?" I looked at Margaret. "What?" She answered quietly. "The brooch." Before I could say anything, Celeste spoke. "I saw Morgan upstairs." I turned toward her. "No, you didn't." Celeste lowered her eyes. "I thought I did." "You didn't." Diane's voice changed immediately. "Morgan." "What? I wasn't upstairs. Don't use that tone." There it was. The shift I already knew. The missing brooch stopped being the problem. My reaction became the problem. Celeste began crying. "I didn't say she took it." "You said you saw me upstairs." "I said I thought I saw you." I looked around the room, waiting for someone to notice the difference. Nobody did. Diane told everyone to stay calm. Then she began checking bags and coats. She called it checking. Years later, I would understand that she was searching for confirmation. My coat was hanging with several others in the front hall. It was a brown corduroy jacket with deep pockets. Diane reached into the right one. Her hand stopped. When she pulled it out, the sapphire brooch was resting in her palm. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. I remember staring at it and thinking the same useless thought again and again. That isn't possible. Diane looked at me as if I had become a stranger in front of her. "Morgan, I didn't put that there." Celeste covered her mouth. Russell finally looked directly at me. "Enough." "I didn't take it." My voice sounded too loud in the quiet house. "I didn't even go upstairs." Diane closed her fingers around the brooch. "Then how did it get into your pocket?" "I don't know." That answer destroyed me. Not because it was false, because it was the truth, and the truth sounded weak. My mother told me to apologize to Margaret. I looked at my grandmother. She was watching me carefully. Not angrily, carefully. I didn't take it, I said. Diane grabbed my arm. We're leaving. Russell collected the car keys. Celeste stayed behind because my aunt offered to drive her home later. Nobody asked why Celeste had been near the stairs. Nobody asked who had access to the coats. Nobody asked why I would steal something from my grandmother and then leave it in an unlocked pocket in a hallway full of people. I was 13. I didn't know how to ask those questions properly yet. I only knew nobody was asking them for me. On the drive home, Diane spoke from the passenger seat. This is serious. I stared out the window. Russell drove. We can't keep pretending these things are normal, she continued. I turned around. What things? She looked back at me. That reaction right there. I almost laughed. I had been accused of stealing. A stolen brooch had appeared in my pocket. I had no explanation. Somehow my confusion was now proof. Russell kept his eyes on the road. Dad, I didn't do it. His hands tightened slightly around the steering wheel. Not now, Morgan. That was all. Not now. For years afterward, my mother would refer to that afternoon as if it were a settled court case. After what happened with your grandmother's brooch. Remember the brooch? We started worrying after the brooch. The story hardened with repetition. Eventually, relatives who had not even been at the party spoke about it as if they had watched me take it. But there was one detail I didn't understand until much later. 3 days after the anniversary, Margaret called the house. I answered. She asked if my mother was home. I said no. There was a pause. Then she asked me one question. Morgan, did anyone ask you where you were when the brooch disappeared? No. Another pause. All right, she said quietly. She didn't tell me she believed me. She didn't accuse Celeste. She only said, all right. At 13, that conversation confused me. Years later, I understood what had happened. For the first time, someone in my family had noticed that the story against me had been accepted before anyone tested it. Margaret had started watching. My parents, meanwhile, decided I needed professional help. Within 2 weeks, Diane made an appointment with a family therapist in Charleston. The reason written on the intake form was simple: behavioral concerns following a family theft incident. I didn't know it then, but the missing brooch had done more than damage my reputation. It had created the first official version of the lie. 2 weeks after the brooch disappeared, my mother drove me to Charleston to see Dr. Helen Mercer. I thought the appointment was supposed to determine what was wrong with me. What I learned instead was that an adult could recognize the truth, explain it clearly, and still be ignored by the people who needed the lie more. The drive took almost 2 hours. Diane barely spoke to me. She kept a travel mug in the cup holder and listened to a morning radio show while I watched the highway through the passenger window. I didn't know what kind of doctor we were visiting until we arrived. Dr. Helen Mercer's office was on the second floor of a converted brick house near a row of small law firms and medical practices. There were no white coats or examination tables. The waiting room had 2 couches, a shelf of board games, and a machine that made a soft rushing sound like rain. My mother completed the paperwork. I tried to read upside down from the chair across from her. Reason for referral: behavioral concerns following a family theft incident. There were other words underneath, but Diane covered the page with her hand when she noticed me looking. Don't start, she said. I didn't say anything. Your face did. That was another rule in our house. Even silence could be used against me if my expression was wrong. Dr. Mercer was in her late 40s then. She had short brown hair and wore reading glasses on a thin chain around her neck. She didn't speak to me like I was a problem she had been hired to solve. That surprised me. During the first appointment, she asked about school, friends, sleep, and what happened when people in my family disagreed. I answered carefully, not because I wanted to lie, because I had learned that describing my family accurately often sounded worse than saying nothing. At one point, she asked, "What happens when you and your sister tell different versions of the same event?" My mom believes Celeste. Every time? I hesitated. Most times. What does your father do? Usually nothing. Dr. Mercer wrote something down. I immediately wanted to know what. The second appointment was different. She asked Diane to bring Celeste. For the first 20 minutes, all three of us sat together. Celeste was charming. She smiled at Dr. Mercer, answered politely, and said she loved me even though I sometimes scared her. I turned toward her. "When have I scared you?" Celeste's eyes filled immediately. "I don't want to fight." I asked a question. Diane touched her shoulder. "See?" she said to Dr. Mercer. "This is what happens." I expected Dr. Mercer to look at me. Instead, she watched my mother. Then she asked Celeste a simple question. "What did Morgan do that frightened you?" Celeste stopped crying for half a second. "I don't remember exactly." "Was it recently?" "I don't know." "Did she threaten you?" Celeste looked at Diane. My mother answered for her. "It's more the atmosphere Morgan creates." Dr. Mercer wrote something down again. For the first time in my life, I saw an adult notice the space between a question and the answer someone else supplied. I didn't understand how important that was yet. The third appointment happened the following week. Dr. Mercer spoke to me alone for most of it. Near the end, she asked me to wait outside while she talked to my parents. Russell had driven separately from work. I sat in the hallway with a magazine open on my knees. The office door didn't close completely. I wasn't trying to listen at first. Then I heard my name. Dr. Mercer's voice was calm. "I don't believe Morgan is the source of the family dynamic you're describing." Nobody answered. She continued. "I am concerned about the pattern between the sisters, but I would strongly recommend an evaluation of Celeste as well." My mother's voice came quickly. "Celeste isn't the one stealing." Dr. Mercer answered. "I'm not making a judgment about the brooch. I'm talking about the behavioral pattern I've observed." There was a pause. Then Russell spoke. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Morgan may be functioning as the identified patient in a larger family system. Treating her alone would be inappropriate." I didn't understand the phrase identified patient. I understood the next sentence. "I recommend family therapy and an individual assessment for the younger child." The hallway suddenly felt very quiet. Diane said, "I think you're being manipulated." Dr. Mercer did not raise her voice. "That is your decision to make. My recommendation will be in the report." I looked down at the magazine. For the first time since the brooch had been found in my coat, I felt something loosen inside me. Not relief exactly. Recognition. An adult had asked questions. An adult had noticed. When my parents came out, Diane's face was stiff. Russell wouldn't look at me. At the front desk, the receptionist handed my mother a small appointment card. "Same time next Thursday," she said. Diane took it. We walked downstairs. In the parking lot, she stopped beside the car and looked at me. "I hope you're happy." I stared at her. "What?" "You embarrassed this family." I didn't say anything. Exactly. I didn't understand that answer either. On the drive home, she told me Dr. Mercer thought I was going through a difficult period and needed to work on how I responded to Celeste. That wasn't what I had heard. I said so. Diane's hands tightened around the steering wheel. "You were listening through a door?" It was open. You hear pieces of conversations and build stories around them. That's part of the problem. I looked at her. She had taken something I heard clearly and turned the act of hearing it into proof that I was unreliable. That was the moment something changed in me. I stopped arguing. The next Thursday came. We didn't return to Charleston. The week after that, Diane told my aunt that a specialist had confirmed I had emotional problems connected to jealousy of Celeste. By Thanksgiving, 3 relatives knew. By Christmas, the story had become that my parents had tried to get me professional help, but I refused to cooperate. I was 13. I had never been given the choice. A month after the last appointment, I found the appointment card from Dr. Mercer's office in the kitchen junk drawer. Diane had apparently emptied her purse and forgotten it there. The card had the doctor's name, office address, and the date of the appointment we never kept. I stood in the kitchen holding it for a long time. Then I put it in my pocket. Upstairs in the back of my closet, I had an old blue metal tin that had once held butter cookies. I opened it and placed the card inside. I didn't call it evidence, not then. I just knew my mother could change a conversation. She could change a memory. She could tell a story often enough that other people would repeat it for her. But she couldn't change the date printed on that card. I closed the lid. That was the first time I deliberately kept something, because I thought the truth might need help surviving. After the appointment card, I began saving things without fully understanding why. At first, it was instinct. Then 3 separate events taught me that records could do what I couldn't: stay calm, keep their story straight, and survive long after everyone else decided to remember something differently. I was 16 when the first lesson came. Swimming was the one part of high school that belonged entirely to me. I wasn't the best athlete on the team, but I was good enough to qualify for a state-level meet that spring. I trained before school 4 mornings a week. 3 days before the team was scheduled to leave, Coach Reynolds called me into his office. He turned his computer monitor toward me. 2 emails had been sent from my school account. Both insulted him. One accused him of favoritism. The other said I planned to embarrass him publicly if he didn't give me a better relay position. I read them twice. I didn't write these. Coach Reynolds sighed. They came from your account. I was at SAT practice when the second one was sent. Morgan, this isn't helping. That sentence was painfully familiar. I wasn't allowed to travel with the team. When I got home, Diane already knew. Celeste was at the kitchen table doing homework. My mother asked, "What did you send?" "Nothing." Celeste looked up. "Maybe someone got into your account." For 1 second, I thought she was defending me. Then she added, "Morgan leaves her passwords written down sometimes." I didn't. Diane accepted it anyway. The next morning, I went to Mr. Patel, a technology teacher who supervised the computer lab. I expected him to dismiss me. Instead, he asked for the printed emails and checked the available header information. He pointed to the timestamp. "You said you were off campus?" "At SAT practice." "Do you have proof?" The testing center had an attendance sheet. Mr. Patel helped me print the email metadata and told me to keep a copy. It didn't identify who had sent the messages, but it showed the second email had been sent from a school network terminal while I was signed in at a testing center 30 miles away. Coach Reynolds let me return to practice. The travel roster had already been finalized. I missed the meet anyway. That was the first lesson. Evidence could prove you were right and still arrive too late to give back what had been taken. I placed the metadata printout in the blue tin. 5 years later, I learned the second lesson. I was 21 and finishing college when I received a collection letter for $7,600. It referred to an apartment near campus. I had never lived there. The leasing office emailed me a copy of the agreement. My full name was on it. My date of birth was correct. So was an old emergency contact number. The signature wasn't mine. I drove home with the papers. Diane read them at the kitchen counter. Celeste was living with our parents temporarily then. When she saw the property name, her expression changed, only for a second, but I saw it. "Do you know something?" I asked. "No." "You recognize the name?" "I've heard of the building." I kept looking at her. Finally, she admitted that an old boyfriend had lived there. Then the story came apart slowly. He couldn't qualify for the lease. Celeste had helped him with the application. She said she had only given him information because she thought he needed a reference. She claimed she had no idea he had used my identity. I asked how he knew my social security number. Celeste started crying. Diane stepped between us. This was obviously a mistake. A $7,000 mistake? You don't know that Celeste did this. I know I didn't. Russell sat in the living room and said nothing. Again. I wanted to report the identity theft immediately. Diane begged me not to. If the police investigate, Celeste could lose everything. I stared at her. I could lose everything. You're stronger than she is. It was one of the cruelest compliments my mother ever gave me. In the end, Diane paid part of the debt from family savings. I was pressured into accepting responsibility for the rest because pursuing the matter would, according to her, destroy Celeste's future. I worked evenings for almost a year. I paid for an apartment I had never entered, but I kept the lease agreement. I kept the collection letters, and I put a sample of my real signature beside the signature on the lease. That was the second lesson. People could argue about intentions. Signatures were harder to argue with. The third lesson came in 2017, after my grandfather Henry died. At the funeral reception in Savannah, I noticed two relatives stop talking when I entered the kitchen. Later, my aunt asked if I was having financial problems. No, why? She looked uncomfortable. Celeste said there had been some concern about Margaret's savings account. I felt my stomach tighten. What concern? She said money had gone missing before. No money had gone missing. I checked. Not by asking my mother. By requesting the information Margaret was legally permitted to share with me directly. There was no unexplained withdrawal matching the story Celeste had spread, but the rumor had already done its job. A week later, Diane informed me that discussions about Margaret's finances would be handled without me. Given the history, she said. What history? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The brooch had become evidence for an event that never happened. The apartment debt had become proof that I was financially irresponsible, even though I had paid someone else's debt. The stories were beginning to support one another. That was what frightened me. Not any single lie. The pattern. A few days after the funeral, I received a message from my cousin Noah Bennett. We weren't especially close. He worked in banking risk analysis and usually avoided family drama. His message was only one sentence. Some of the numbers in this story don't add up. I read it several times. Then I replied, "What numbers?" He didn't give me a full answer. He said he had heard Celeste talking about Margaret's accounts and knew at least one claim didn't match the timeline he remembered. He ended with, "Keep your records." I took a screenshot. Then I added it to the tin. By then, the container was no longer holding random pieces of my past. It had categories, dates, names, copies. I didn't know the phrase evidence chain yet. I didn't understand audit trails or document preservation. I had never heard anyone discuss metadata outside that computer lab, but I was beginning to understand something important. A lie could change shape. It could move from a missing piece of jewelry to an email, from an email to a forged lease, from a forged lease to a rumor about money. The details changed. The structure didn't. Celeste created the doubt. Diane gave it authority. Russell refused to challenge it, and I was expected to absorb the consequence. For years, I thought my job was to become better at explaining myself. I finally stopped. I started becoming better at keeping receipts. By the time I moved to Charlotte, keeping records was no longer just a habit. I had learned how to read them. What my family saw as a boring office job became the first place in my life where asking questions was considered a strength instead of a character flaw. I didn't plan to become an investigator. After college, I took an entry-level compliance position at North Star Medical Systems because I needed stable work and health insurance. North Star supplied specialized medical equipment to hospitals and outpatient centers across several states. The company was large enough that money moved through thousands of contracts, purchase orders, expense reports, and vendor accounts every month. My first job was mostly review work. I checked forms, compared invoices, flagged missing approvals. It should have bored me. Instead, I noticed things. A vendor submitted 2 invoices with different numbers but identical descriptions. An employee approved payments at times when his calendar showed he was overseas. A consulting company used an address that matched a relative of the manager who hired it. Small details bothered me until they made sense. My supervisor at the time, Karen Willis, noticed. One afternoon, she placed 3 folders on my desk. "You keep finding things nobody asked you to find." I wasn't sure whether that was criticism. "Is that a problem?" She smiled. "Not in this department." Karen moved me into internal investigations 6 months later. That was where I learned the difference between suspicion and proof. Suspicion was noticing that something felt wrong. Proof was showing exactly how it happened. I learned to build timelines from access logs. I learned how metadata could place a document in the hands of someone who claimed never to have seen it. I learned that a payment could pass through several legitimate-looking accounts and still leave a trace. Most importantly, I learned chain of custody. If evidence mattered, it had to be collected correctly. stored correctly, documented correctly. A screenshot without context could be challenged. A preserved record obtained through the proper process was harder to dismiss. The work suited me in a way I hadn't expected. At home, asking a second question had always made me difficult. At North Star, asking the second question was often the job. Over the years, I moved from analyst to investigator, then to senior compliance investigator. I handled vendor misconduct, conflicts of interest, procurement fraud, and internal financial irregularities. Some cases were simple, others took months. One investigation began with a $43 discrepancy in a shipping invoice and ended with 3 employees being terminated for routing hundreds of thousands of dollars through a vendor secretly owned by a relative. That case changed how I thought about evidence. The first discrepancy wasn't important because of the amount. It was important because it was a door. My family knew almost none of this. At Thanksgiving one year, an uncle asked what I did for work. Before I could answer, Diane said, "Morgan handles paperwork for a medical company." I looked at her. "That isn't exactly what I do." She waved one hand. "You know what I mean." Celeste laughed. "So basically, if someone forgets to sign a form, Morgan hunts them down?" A few people smiled. I could have corrected her. Instead, I said, "Something like that." Celeste lost interest immediately. That became useful. She continued thinking of me as the sister who organized folders and worried about rules. She had no idea I had interviewed executives with lawyers present. She didn't know I had traced hidden financial relationships through vendor registrations and transaction histories. She definitely didn't know I had spent years learning how people behave when they believe nobody is looking at the right detail. I never lied about my work. Celeste simply never respected me enough to ask. The irony was that some of my professional habits had started because of her. I knew timestamps mattered because of the emails that cost me the swim meet. I knew signatures deserved comparison because of the apartment lease. I knew financial claims had to be checked against actual records because of the rumor about Margaret's savings. At North Star, those lessons gained names: audit trail, document authentication, transaction mapping, evidence preservation. The things I had done as a frightened teenager became skills people trusted me to use professionally. That changed me. Not all at once. I stopped feeling pressure to answer every accusation immediately. At work, reacting too fast could destroy an investigation. If someone suspected they were being examined, they might delete records, coordinate stories, or create explanations. So I learned patience. Verify first, preserve second. Act when the facts can survive resistance. My parents interpreted that change as distance. Celeste interpreted it as weakness. At a family dinner, she once told me, "You've gotten quieter." Diane answered for me, "That's probably a good thing." I looked across the table at Celeste. She was smiling. I smiled back. Probably. She had no idea what silence meant in my world now. It didn't mean surrender, it meant I was listening. By my mid-30s, I had a stable life in Charlotte. My apartment was quiet. My work was demanding but predictable in the ways that mattered. At North Star, nobody asked me to accept a story because it made someone more comfortable. If numbers didn't match, we checked them. If a signature looked wrong, we compared it. If money moved, we followed it. My family still thought I pushed paper. I let them. For the first time in my life, being underestimated didn't feel like humiliation. It felt like privacy. I didn't know then that I would eventually need every skill North Star had taught me. I didn't know the most personal investigation of my life would begin with something as ordinary as an email. But by the time that happened, I was no longer 13 years old, standing in a room full of adults and saying I didn't know how the brooch got into my pocket. I had learned how to answer a different question. Not who does everyone believe? What can I prove? My family thought Margaret's building in Savannah would eventually belong to Diane, and then, in some form, to Celeste. For years, I let them believe that. Not because I was planning revenge, but because my grandmother had left instructions, and for once in my family, I intended to respect exactly what was written down. Margaret owned a 3-story commercial building a few blocks from the historic district. It wasn't glamorous. The brick needed cleaning. The second-floor hallway always smelled faintly like old wood and coffee. The 6 rental spaces included a small accounting office, a tailor, 2 professional suites, and a cafe on the ground floor. But the building had been in Margaret's family for decades. By the time my grandfather Henry died in 2017, it was worth considerably more than anyone had expected. That was when Diane began talking about it differently, not as Margaret's building, as a family asset. At Thanksgiving one year, I heard her telling Celeste that the property would give them options later. Celeste asked, "Could we sell it?" Diane lowered her voice, though not enough. "Eventually. Your grandmother doesn't like talking about those things." I was sitting in the next room. Neither of them asked what Margaret wanted. A few months later, Margaret called me. Her health had begun to decline, but her mind was still sharp. She asked me to come to Savannah alone. When I arrived, she wasn't at home. She was waiting in a law office. That immediately told me the meeting wasn't social. A trust attorney named Samuel Price sat across from us. Beside him was a woman from a fiduciary administration firm. Margaret pointed at the chair next to her. "Sit down, Morgan." I did. Mr. Price opened a folder and began explaining a restructuring plan involving the commercial property. At first, I thought I was there as a witness. Then he used the words successor trustee. I looked at Margaret. "What?" She didn't smile. "Listen first." So I did. The ownership structure was more complicated than simply putting my name on a deed. The majority economic interest in the property would be held through a trust structure. A professional fiduciary administrator would oversee income distribution, accounting, taxes, and required reporting. I would serve as successor trustee under the conditions laid out in the trust documents. The restructuring involved refinancing and administrative transitions that were still underway. Certain information was not to be disclosed casually during that period, especially to family members who were not beneficiaries or decision-makers under the trust. I read the first page twice. Then I looked at Margaret. "Why me?" She leaned back in her chair. "Because you read things before you signed them." I almost laughed. She didn't. Mr. Price excused himself with the administrator and gave us the room. For a few seconds, Margaret looked down at her hands. Then she said, "Do you remember my brooch?" My body went still. I hadn't expected that. "Yes." "I never believed you took it." I stared at her. She had never said those words before, not once. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" The question came out sharper than I intended. Margaret accepted it. "Because I wasn't certain what happened, and because I was a coward about conflict." That answer hurt, but it was more honest than anything my parents had ever given me. She continued, "I started paying attention after that. To Celeste? To everyone." Margaret told me she had noticed how stories changed depending on who was telling them. She noticed Diane explaining events before I had a chance to speak. She noticed Russell disappearing into silence whenever choosing a side became uncomfortable. And she noticed something else. "You kept papers." I looked at her. "How do you know that?" "You asked me for bank records after Henry's funeral instead of arguing with your mother." I didn't answer. Margaret nodded slowly. "Everyone else wanted me to tell them what they were getting. You wanted to know whether money was actually missing." That was when I understood. The trust wasn't an apology. It wasn't compensation for the brooch. Margaret wasn't trying to correct my childhood with real estate. She was assigning responsibility to the person she believed would follow the documents. That made the weight of it feel heavier. "I don't know anything about managing commercial property." "You don't need to know everything," she said. "You need to know when to ask someone who does." The fiduciary administrator returned and spent the next hour walking me through reporting requirements, distributions, leasing authority, tax obligations, and restrictions. I asked questions, a lot of them. When the meeting ended, I left with copies of documents I was permitted to retain and instructions for accessing the rest through counsel and the administrator. I didn't put those papers in the blue tin. They were too important for that. They went into a secure document system with professional records maintained by the administrator and counsel. That difference mattered to me. The tin held my history. The trust records held legal authority. Over the next few years, the transition continued quietly. County filings reflected the approved structure. Refinancing was handled through the proper channels. Rental income moved through professionally administered accounts. I didn't take money whenever I wanted. I couldn't. That wasn't how the trust worked. I continued going to North Star every morning and paying my bills from my salary. Meanwhile, Diane kept talking as if the building were waiting for her. Once during a family phone call, she mentioned that Celeste had ideas for using our Savannah property as part of a future business expansion. I said, "You should be careful about making plans around property you don't control." Diane laughed. "You've always been so negative." Celeste added, "Not everything has to be an investigation, Morgan." I let the conversation end there. They thought I was being difficult. They had no idea I was speaking as the person legally responsible for protecting that asset. I could have corrected them. I didn't. The trust wasn't a weapon, and I refused to turn it into one simply because my family had spent years using everything else against me. But I did make one decision. I began reviewing every quarterly report, every lease change, every distribution statement, every county filing connected to the property. Not because I expected Celeste to do anything, because Margaret had trusted me to pay attention. For most of my life, my family had treated my attention to detail as evidence that something was wrong with me. Margaret had done the opposite. She had made it a responsibility. That mattered more than the value of the building. By the time the trust administration was fully functioning, Diane and Celeste were still talking about Savannah as if the future had already promised it to them. I never corrected them publicly. I never threatened them with the documents. I never used the property to force an apology. I simply kept doing what Margaret had asked me to do: read, verify, protect. Years later, those three things would matter far beyond the building itself. But at the time, the trust was just one more truth my family didn't know about me. And unlike the stories they told, this truth was recorded in documents they couldn't rewrite. Celeste had always been good at telling a story people wanted to believe. What changed was that she finally found a way to charge for it. Clear Harbor Collective turned our family history into a product, and I slowly realized the lie about me was no longer protecting my sister. It was paying her bills. Clear Harbor started small. At first, Celeste posted short videos about boundaries and difficult family relationships. She spoke calmly, usually from a bright room with plants behind her and a cup of tea in both hands. The videos were polished without looking expensive. That was part of her talent. Celeste knew how to make preparation look like vulnerability. She talked about growing up in a home where one person controlled the emotional temperature of every room. She described learning to make herself smaller to avoid conflict. She spoke about being afraid to celebrate her own success because someone close to her would punish her for being happy. She never used my name, but she used details. An older sister, 3 years older, someone who was obsessed with being right, someone who kept records of disagreements, someone who worked in a rule-focused corporate job. Anyone who knew us understood. The first time a relative sent me one of the videos, I watched the whole thing. The second time, I stopped halfway through. After that, I saved the links and moved on. Not because the videos didn't bother me, because I had learned the difference between pain and useful information. Clear Harbor grew quickly. Celeste added private coaching sessions, then weekend retreats. After that came a certification program for women who wanted to become family recovery coaches. The prices rose with the audience. So did the story. In early interviews, Celeste said she had experienced difficult family dynamics. A year later, she described herself as a survivor of long-term emotional abuse. Later still, she talked about a close relative whose jealousy had made the entire family unsafe. Each version became more specific. Each version also sold something: a webinar, a workbook, a retreat, a certification package. Diane loved it. She shared Celeste's interviews with everyone she knew. Sometimes she appeared in live streams herself. In one video, a host asked Diane what it had been like to watch her younger daughter struggle. My mother looked down before answering. It was a performance I recognized immediately. "We tried to love both our daughters," she said. But sometimes protecting one child means accepting hard truths about another. I paused the video. For several seconds, I just stared at her face. That sentence was better than anything Diane had ever said at a family dinner. Cleaner, more careful. It made her sound heartbroken instead of responsible. The comments underneath praised her courage as a mother. I closed the browser. Russell stayed mostly away from cameras. Public attention made him uncomfortable. But when Clear Harbor needed a statement confirming parts of Celeste's background, he signed one. I learned about that later through a promotional packet. The language was vague. It referred to a long history of family conflict and efforts to obtain professional support. Professional support. 2 words. That was all it took to turn 3 appointments with Dr. Mercer into marketing material. I started saving public material related to Clear Harbor. Not obsessively. I wasn't building a case, not yet. I saved interviews where Celeste made specific factual claims, screenshots of marketing pages, public descriptions of her family's story, a few promotional documents sent to potential partners. The material showed something I hadn't expected. The story about me wasn't just part of Celeste's identity. It was part of the company's value. Clear Harbor's marketing depended on authenticity. Celeste wasn't presenting herself as someone who had studied family systems from a distance. She was selling lived experience. Her story was the credential. That changed the stakes. If she admitted she had lied about me, she wouldn't just lose an argument with her sister. She could damage the business built around that lie. Around the same time, I began hearing that Clear Harbor was expanding faster than its revenue could support. I didn't discover that through investigation. People talked. A former contractor mentioned delayed payments. A retreat venue reportedly demanded a larger deposit after an invoice was paid late. Celeste began promoting future programs before earlier ones had finished. None of that proved fraud. Growing companies have cash flow problems. I knew that better than most people. But then Noah sent me a short message. "Have you heard what Celeste is saying about Savannah?" I called him. "What do you mean?" She mentioned family commercial property to someone I know. My attention sharpened. "What exactly did she say?" "That Clear Harbor has long-term family asset backing." I stayed quiet. Noah noticed. "Morgan? Did she identify the property?" "Savannah, commercial building." I looked across my apartment toward the locked cabinet where I kept my authorized trust materials. "Did she put that in writing?" "Not that I've seen." "Then don't assume anything yet." Noah gave a short laugh. "You sound like a lawyer." "No, I sound like someone who wants the document before the accusation." He didn't know the full trust structure. Almost nobody in the family did. I didn't explain it then. But after that call, I began paying closer attention to Clear Harbor's public expansion. Celeste announced a larger studio, then a national coaching initiative, then plans for partnerships with wellness organizations in multiple states. The image was success. The spending suggested pressure, and somewhere behind the image, she had started talking about a building she did not own. At a family dinner, Diane mentioned that Celeste might eventually use our Savannah property to support the business. I asked one question. "Has anyone checked what the ownership records actually say?" Celeste smiled across the table. "There she goes." Diane sighed. "Can we have one meal without you looking for a problem?" I asked a question. "You always do," Celeste said. Russell kept eating. I didn't explain the trust. I didn't mention county filings. I didn't tell Celeste that I reviewed quarterly reports on the property she was casually using to impress people. She thought my question came from jealousy. That mistake gave her confidence, and confidence made her careless. Over the next year, Clear Harbor's marketing began shifting toward investors and larger commercial partnerships. The language changed. Words like resilience and healing remained, but now they appeared beside growth projections, national expansion plans, and references to long-term family assets. I saved what was public, nothing more. At that point, I still didn't know how far Celeste had gone. I only understood the motive. She needed the story about me because the story gave her credibility. She needed Clear Harbor to look successful because success attracted money, and she needed people to believe she had access to family wealth because the company itself was under pressure. For the first time, the different parts of Celeste's life were beginning to depend on the same lie. Her victim story, her company, her promises about Savannah. She thought those things made her stronger. From where I stood, they looked like 3 records that would eventually have to agree. The email looked ordinary enough that I almost deleted it. A financing company wanted me to confirm a business loan guarantee for $184,000. I had never heard of the company applying for the money, and I had never guaranteed a loan for anyone. Within 3 days, I realized that email was not a mistake. Someone had built an entire financial identity around pieces of my life. It arrived on a Tuesday morning near the end of 2024. I was drinking coffee at my desk before work when I saw the subject line, "Guarantor confirmation required." At first, I assumed it was spam. Then I saw my full name, Morgan Elise Hale. The email referenced a financing application and asked me to confirm my role as personal guarantor for a $184,000 business loan. I read it twice. Then I stopped touching the keyboard. At North Star, one of the first rules in an investigation was simple: don't alter the source material before you preserve it. I saved the original message and recorded the available header information. Then I called the financing company using a verified number from its public records, not anything inside the email. The representative confirmed that the application existed. "I think there's been identity theft," I said. Her tone changed immediately. She transferred me to fraud review. After verifying my identity, the investigator gave me limited information and explained the process for formally disputing the guarantee. The application used my name, an old address in Raleigh, a phone number I didn't recognize, and personal information that was accurate enough to pass preliminary verification. I asked for copies of anything I was legally entitled to receive. The first packet arrived electronically 2 days later. I printed it. Then I cleared my dining table. I had built evidence matrices for North Star investigations dozens of times. I had never expected to build one with my own name in the subject column. I started with 5 categories: identity used, address, contact number, application date, verification method. The $184,000 loan application used Morgan E. Hale. The Raleigh address belonged to an apartment where I had lived for 6 months after college. The electronic signature record showed a verification sequence involving a security question: my mother's maiden name. I sat back in my chair. That information wasn't secret in the traditional sense. Family members knew it. Old forms might have contained it, but I remembered something. Years earlier, Celeste had asked several family members for personal details because she said she was creating an anniversary album for Diane and Russell. Birthplaces, old addresses, family names, dates. At the time, it had seemed harmless. I still didn't accuse her. Suspicion wasn't proof. I ordered my credit reports and began checking business credit inquiries associated with variations of my name. The first report gave me 2 accounts I didn't recognize. The second gave me another. Then I found a personal credit card under Morgan E. Hale using the Raleigh address. Another used M. Elise Hale. A third used my current last name, but an older phone number connected to a family plan from years earlier. The structure was deliberate. Not one identity, several versions of the same identity. That mattered. If everything had been opened under identical information, automated fraud systems might have connected the activity sooner. Instead, the applications were spread across variations of my name, different addresses, and different contact details. I created a second sheet in the matrix: account type, original amount, current exposure, identity variation, contact data, linked business. The numbers began adding up: a business credit line, 2 smaller financing arrangements, 3 personal credit cards, an equipment lease, then another commercial credit account. By midnight, the total potential obligation was over $250,000. I stopped calculating and walked into the kitchen. My hands were shaking. That surprised me. I had investigated larger fraud cases at work. I had sat across from executives who lied while their attorneys took notes. I knew how to stay calm around numbers. but those numbers had never belonged to me. I poured a glass of water and stood at the sink until my hands settled. Then I went back to the table. I kept working. Over the next 2 weeks, the total exposure passed $327,000. Some accounts were active. Some had already been partially paid down. That detail caught my attention. Identity thieves often took money and disappeared. Someone here was servicing certain obligations while allowing others to fall behind. That suggested the accounts were being used to support an ongoing operation. I added a new column, payment source. Most of that information wasn't available to me yet. But now I knew what I needed. The original loan email gave me another path. Its header data showed routing information tied to the application process. Through the formal dispute process, I obtained confirmation that the application session had originated from an IP address in a city where I had not been on the date listed. I checked my own records. That day, I had been physically present at North Star. Badge access, meeting calendar, parking record. I didn't need those records for anyone else yet. I needed them to eliminate myself from my own timeline. That was how investigations worked. You didn't start by proving who did something. You started by proving what could not be true. The application could not have been completed by me from that location. I looked at the IP information again. I didn't recognize the address, so I added it to the matrix. Loan application, email confirmation, e-signature verification, security question, IP address, 5 pieces, 1 line. I had not contacted Celeste. I had not called Diane. I had not asked Russell whether he knew anything. The old version of me would have demanded answers immediately. The woman I had become knew better. If Celeste was involved and I confronted her too early, I would learn only one thing: what explanation she wanted me to hear. I wanted records. I wanted dates. I wanted connections that existed independently of anyone's memory. So I worked quietly. I created secure copies of every document I received. I kept a log of when each record arrived and where it came from. I separated assumptions from verified facts. In one column, I wrote Celeste's name. Then I marked it unconfirmed. That was harder than it sounds. I knew her history. I knew the apartment lease. I knew what she had done with family information. But knowing someone's pattern did not give me permission to skip the proof. One night, I opened the blue metal tin. I looked at the old lease agreement, then the metadata printout from high school, then Noah's message. For years, those things had been fragments from different parts of my life. Now I understood that they had trained me for something, not revenge, method. I closed the tin and returned to the evidence matrix. By then, the question was no longer whether someone had used my identity. That was established. The real questions were larger. Who benefited? Where had the money gone? And why had the person behind it been so confident I would never look closely enough to find out? For the first time in my life, someone had built a lie around my name and made one serious mistake. They had left me the records. The first loan told me someone had used my identity. The next step was harder. I needed to prove where the applications came from, who had access to the contact information, and whether the money had benefited anyone I could identify. I stopped looking at the accounts as separate problems and started treating them as one connected system. The IP address from the $184,000 application led to a co-working studio outside Charlotte. I confirmed the location through records provided during the fraud dispute process. The studio rented private offices by the month and conference rooms by the hour. It also offered shared Wi-Fi and temporary workstations. That meant the IP address alone proved very little. Hundreds of people could have used that network. I wrote the studio name in my matrix and marked the connection as location only. That distinction mattered. A weak investigator sees a familiar location and decides the case is solved. A good investigator asks what the evidence actually proves. I needed more. The loan application had been submitted on a Thursday afternoon at 2:17. A second commercial credit application had activity from the same network several weeks later. 2 dates, same location. I checked Clear Harbor's public calendar. Celeste had promoted a private workshop from that part of the city on the first date. On the second, Clear Harbor had posted behind-the-scenes photographs from a planning session. Interesting. Still not proof. I contacted the co-working company through the proper fraud review process and requested preservation of any records associated with the relevant dates. I wasn't entitled to simply demand private customer information, and I knew that. So I documented the request and moved on. The phone number was the next thread. 2 financing applications had been verified through the same prepaid number. The account wasn't registered in a way that immediately identified a user. I searched my own archived communications. Nothing. Then I searched old family group messages. Still nothing. Finally, I found the number somewhere I didn't expect, an old food delivery confirmation. 3 years earlier, Celeste had ordered dinner during a family weekend in Savannah. She had used my email address because, according to her at the time, her app wasn't working. The delivery confirmation listed the prepaid number as the contact for the order. I stared at the screen. Then I printed the record and marked the connection carefully. Prepaid number used by Celeste. Historical, documented use. Not ownership, not exclusive control. Use. The difference mattered. I had 2 independent connections now. The co-working location, the prepaid number. Both touched Celeste. Neither was enough alone. Together, they justified going further. That was when I hired a licensed investigator. His name was Daniel Cross. Rebecca Sloan had not entered the case yet, but I knew enough from my work to understand where my limits were. I could analyze records I legally possessed. I could dispute fraudulent accounts. I could review public information. I could not follow people, obtain restricted records through deception, or turn a personal investigation into amateur surveillance. Daniel understood the assignment immediately. I don't want conclusions, I told him during our first meeting. Good. I want documented observations. Better. If something can't be verified, I don't want it written like it can. He looked at me for a second. You do this for a living? Something close to it. Daniel began with the equipment lease. That account bothered me because it was different from the others. Credit cards could disappear into general spending. A commercial loan could be moved through accounts I couldn't yet see. Leased equipment had to exist somewhere. The documents I obtained through the identity theft dispute listed a delivery location near Columbia, South Carolina. Not a Clear Harbor office, a warehouse. Daniel verified that the warehouse rented storage units to small businesses and event companies. He spent 2 days documenting activity from public access areas. On the 3rd day, he called me. I have something. What kind of something? Photographs first, interpretation later. I liked him immediately for that answer. The photographs arrived through a secure file transfer. The first showed a box truck outside the warehouse. The second showed workers loading folded staging panels, portable lighting equipment, audio cases, and branded display structures. The third photograph changed the case. One of the rolling cases had a Clear Harbor Collective inventory label. I enlarged the image. Then I checked public photographs from Celeste's retreats. Same equipment type, same staging system, same branded case. Daniel had also documented the vehicle transporting the equipment to a Clear Harbor event venue. That was the first physical connection between an obligation opened under my identity and Celeste's business operations. I sat at my dining table with the equipment lease on one side and Daniel's verification report on the other. For years, Celeste's lies had existed in places where she could change the explanation. A family dinner, a private conversation, a story told after I left the room. This was different. The equipment existed. It had serial numbers, delivery records, storage records, photographs, a location, a business user. I added a new line to the matrix. Fraudulent equipment lease to Columbia, warehouse to Clear Harbor event use. Then I stopped. I read the line again. Until that moment, some part of me had still been treating the fraud as an attack against me. Now I saw the larger possibility. My identity might have been financing Celeste's company. I reviewed the other accounts again. The amounts, the opening dates, Clear Harbor's expansion announcements, studio upgrades, retreat launches, certification programs. The timing wasn't perfect enough to prove a direct connection, but it was close enough to create a question I could no longer ignore. Had Celeste been using my credit identity to keep Clear Harbor alive? Daniel continued working. The co-working records eventually became available through the appropriate fraud process. They showed that Clear Harbor had rented workspace there during the relevant period. The check-in records placed Celeste at the studio on one of the application dates. On the second date, a Clear Harbor staff reservation covered the time when account activity occurred. Again, I separated what I knew from what I suspected. The first date placed Celeste physically at the source location. The second placed her business there. The prepaid number had documented historical use by Celeste. The equipment acquired through my identity was being used at Clear Harbor events. The chain was becoming stronger because each part came from a different source: a lender, a co-working company, an old delivery record, a warehouse location, a licensed investigator's documented observations, public event material. If all of it had come from one person, Celeste could attack that person's credibility. If it all came from one system, she could claim the system was wrong. But independent records were harder to explain away. That was something I had learned at North Star. The strongest cases were rarely built around one dramatic piece of evidence. They were built when unrelated records started telling the same story. I created a timeline across the wall of my home office. Not with red string and photographs like a television detective. Just dates, account activity, known locations, Clear Harbor events, equipment movement, verified contact information. I used different labels for confirmed fact, probable connection, and unresolved question. Celeste's name appeared more often as the timeline developed, but I still did not call her. I didn't tell Diane. I didn't ask Russell to choose a side. My family had spent years making every conflict about personalities. I refused to let this become another argument about whether I was jealous of my sister. This was about transactions. One evening, Daniel called after finishing his report. "You know what I think?" he asked. "I'd rather know what you can document." He laughed once. "Fair enough." Then his voice became serious. "I can document that equipment tied to the disputed lease is being stored, transported, and used for Clear Harbor events. Anything connecting Celeste personally to the lease?" "Not yet." That answer didn't disappoint me. It clarified the next problem. Someone had applied using my identity. Someone had provided family information. Someone had used a phone number connected to Celeste. Applications had originated from a location used by Celeste and Clear Harbor. And equipment obtained through one fraudulent obligation was benefiting Clear Harbor. I had impersonation. I was beginning to establish benefit. What I did not yet have was the bridge between them. I closed Daniel's report and looked at the matrix. For the first time, the pattern no longer felt personal. It felt structural. That changed the way I saw Celeste. I wasn't looking at the little sister who had lied about a brooch. I was looking at the head of a company whose expansion might be connected to more than $327,000 in obligations opened through pieces of my identity. The difference was enormous. So was the risk. I backed up the records in separate secure locations and updated my evidence log. Every document had a source. Every source had a date. Every conclusion was labeled according to what the underlying record could actually support. Then I removed one word from the top of my private notes. I had originally called the folder Identity Theft. That was still true, it just wasn't complete anymore. I renamed it Financial Benefit Analysis because the question had changed. I no longer needed to prove that someone had used my name. I needed to prove where the value went. And for the first time, the trail was pointing toward a business that had been built by selling the story that I was the dangerous one. By the time I realized my parents had put $210,000 of their retirement money into Clear Harbor, the transfer had already happened. They hadn't been tricked by a stranger. They had chosen Celeste over every warning sign in front of them. And when I tried to protect them, my mother handed my warning directly to the person I was worried about. I learned about the investment on a Sunday afternoon. Diane called while I was reviewing quarterly trust reports at my kitchen table. She sounded unusually cheerful. Your father and I finally made a decision. About what? Our future. I put down my pen. That phrase usually meant they were considering a move or planning another expensive vacation. Instead, Diane told me they had invested in Clear Harbor. How much? There was a pause. That's personal. You called to tell me about it. I called because I thought you'd be happy for your sister. How much, Mom? Her tone hardened. $210,000. I said nothing. Diane rushed to fill the silence. It isn't reckless. Celeste has a national agreement coming. This is a real business opportunity. What national agreement? I don't know every detail. Who is the counterparty? Morgan. Is there a signed contract? My mother exhaled loudly. This is exactly why I didn't want to tell you. I closed the trust report in front of me. Where did the money come from? That's none of your business. Retirement accounts? Another pause. That was my answer. I asked whether they had received audited financial statements. Diane didn't know what I meant. I asked whether they had reviewed Clear Harbor's debt schedule. She accused me of trying to make the company sound unstable. I asked whether an attorney had reviewed the investment documents. That ended the conversation. You cannot stand that Celeste built something successful, she said. This isn't about Celeste. It is always about Celeste with you. Then she hung up. I sat at the table for several minutes. The old version of me would have called back. I would have tried to explain that I wasn't jealous. I would have defended my questions one by one until the argument became proof that I was the problem. I didn't do that. I opened my laptop. If my parents had invested $210,000, there would be documents. I couldn't access them without permission, and I wasn't going to cross that line. So I wrote a short email to Diane and Russell. I kept it factual. I told them that before investing additional money, they should obtain audited financial statements, current debt disclosures, copies of any material contracts supporting projected revenue, and documented proof of any assets represented as financial backing for the company. I also suggested independent legal review. I did not mention the identity theft investigation. I did not mention the equipment lease. I did not mention the Savannah Trust. Not yet. I ended with one sentence. Please do not invest additional retirement funds until these items have been independently verified. I sent it to both of them. Russell never replied. Diane responded 40 minutes later. You always assume the worst about your sister. That was all. 2 days later, Celeste called me. I let it go to voicemail. Then a text arrived. Stay out of my business. I looked at the screen. I had not copied Celeste on the email. I had sent it only to Diane and Russell. That meant one of them had forwarded it. I already knew which one. Still, I didn't react. I saved the message. An hour later, Celeste sent another. Mom and Dad are adults. You don't control everyone. I read that one more carefully. She wasn't defending the investment. She was reframing my warning as control. It was familiar territory for her. But something had changed. For the first time, my questions threatened money. I requested a meeting with Daniel Cross and showed him only the material relevant to his work. Then I began reviewing what Clear Harbor had publicly claimed about its expansion. The national agreement Diane mentioned bothered me. A contract large enough to justify a $210,000 family investment should leave some footprint. A partnership announcement, a counterparty reference, a procurement notice, something. I found nothing. That didn't prove the contract was fake. Private agreements exist. Confidential negotiations happen. So I waited. 3 weeks later, Noah called. He didn't bother with small talk. Did your parents invest? Yes. How much? I hesitated. 210? He was quiet. Then he said, That's worse than I thought. What do you know? Noah had heard Celeste discussing a national wellness services contract with potential investors. She claimed Clear Harbor was entering a multi-state arrangement that would produce predictable revenue for several years. Do you have the name of the organization? He gave it to me. I recognized the type immediately. It was a large nonprofit healthcare network, I did not contact the organization pretending to be an investor or a customer. I used only legitimate public sources and professional databases I was authorized to consult for general corporate verification. No partnership announcement existed. No public procurement trail matched Celeste's description. Again, absence was not proof. But then Noah obtained something better through a source who had received Clear Harbor's investment presentation. A projection page. The national agreement appeared as anticipated contracted revenue. Anticipated, not executed. That single word mattered. Celeste had apparently told my parents the agreement was coming and presented the revenue as part of the company's future. But in investor material, the language was carefully softened. I asked Noah, "Do you have the full deck?" "Not yet." "Don't push anyone to get it improperly." "I know. I mean it." "I know, Morgan." The following month, I learned more about my parents' investment through documents they had voluntarily signed and later referenced during another family discussion. The money had been wired in 2 transfers. The first was $125,000. The second was $85,000. The subscription agreement described the investment as high risk and contained no guaranteed return. That part was legal and clear. The problem was what my parents believed they were buying into. Diane told relatives that Clear Harbor had secured national expansion. Russell told Noah that the company had contracts lined up. The written investment material didn't say that. The gap between the spoken promise and the document was growing. I updated my timeline. Parent investment, 2 wire transfers, national contract claim, investor projection language, no verified executed agreement. Then I connected that timeline to the other one. Fraudulent obligations opened under variations of my identity. Clear Harbor expansion, equipment lease, cash flow pressure, family investment. A company under pressure needs money. A founder under pressure needs people to believe the company is stronger than it is. And Celeste had 2 things she knew how to sell: her story and the appearance of family wealth. A week later, Diane called again. This time, she wasn't cheerful. She wanted to know why I'd been asking questions about Clear Harbor. "I sent you and Dad one email. You've been talking to Noah." Noah called me. "Celeste says you're trying to damage investor confidence." I almost laughed. "Mom, I haven't spoken to an investor. You're digging around." I asked whether you saw financial statements before putting retirement money into a private company. Same thing. "No, it isn't." Her voice dropped. "You've always wanted her to fail." There it was. The oldest weapon in the family. Jealousy. I looked at the warning email on my screen while she talked. For once, I didn't defend myself. I said, "I hope I'm wrong." That stopped her for a moment. Then she said, "You are." "Okay. You don't believe me." "No, but I hope I'm wrong." She ended the call. I saved a note of the conversation for my own chronology, but the important record already existed. The email, dated, specific, sent before any public collapse, sent before any demand for repayment, sent before my parents could say nobody had warned them. That was the real reason I had written instead of argued. Memory could be negotiated. A timestamp couldn't. My relationship with Russell changed more quietly. He called one evening and asked whether I thought they would lose the money. "I don't know." "Your mother thinks you're overreacting." "Then why are you asking me?" He didn't answer. I could hear a television in the background. Finally, he said, "Celeste says the contract will be announced soon." "Then ask to see it." "She says it's confidential." "Then have your lawyer review it under confidentiality." Another silence. "You always make things complicated." "No, Dad, money is complicated." He sighed. I knew what he wanted. He wanted me to say everything would be fine. I couldn't, and I wouldn't lie to make him comfortable. After we hung up, I sat in the dark for a while. I was angry with Celeste, but what I felt toward my parents was different. They had spent my entire life demanding that I absorb consequences because Celeste was fragile. Now they had taken money meant for their old age and placed it inside her version of reality. I had warned them. They had forwarded the warning to her, and Celeste had responded by treating me as an enemy. That told me something important. My questions had reached a nerve. Clear Harbor did not just need money. Celeste needed control over the stories surrounding the money. I added her texts to the chronology. Not because they proved fraud. They didn't. They proved escalation. Before the investment, I was the sister Celeste could use in a speech. After the investment, I was a financial threat. The difference was subtle, but I knew better than to ignore subtle changes. At North Star, pressure revealed priorities. People protected what mattered most. Celeste was protecting Clear Harbor. Diane was protecting her investment by believing Celeste. Russell was protecting himself from the possibility that he had made a catastrophic mistake. And I was protecting the record. For the first time, every person in my family had something financial to lose. That made the truth more dangerous. It also made motive easier to understand. I saved the warning email in the case chronology and marked the date. Then I wrote one note beside it. Family notified before further escalation. I wasn't preparing to punish my parents. I was preparing for the day they might ask me to rescue them from a decision they had made with their eyes open. And this time, I intended to remember exactly when I had tried. The equipment proved that Clear Harbor had benefited from at least one obligation opened under my identity. But physical assets were only one part of the picture. Money moved faster than equipment. And if I wanted to understand what Celeste had built, I needed to find the account sitting between the financing and her company. The name appeared in a transfer reference connected to one of the disputed commercial accounts. Bright Current Strategy, LLC. I had never heard of it. The name sounded deliberately forgettable. The kind of consulting company that could mean almost anything. I started with public business records. Bright Current had been formed 18 months earlier. Its registered organizer was Lila Grant. I knew the name. Lila wasn't family. She had appeared in Clear Harbor photographs for years. Sometimes she was described as a strategic advisor. Other times, operations director. On Celeste's social media, she was simply one of the people tagged in photographs from retreats and planning sessions. I added her to the matrix. Then I pulled the public filing history. Bright Current had no visible staff, no meaningful public presence, and no clear operating history outside its relationship to businesses connected with wellness consulting. That alone wasn't suspicious. Plenty of legitimate consulting companies were small. The transfer notes were more useful. One disputed financing account showed a payment reference connected to Bright Current. Another record obtained through the formal fraud process showed funds moving toward a payment processor account associated with Clear Harbor. The chain wasn't complete yet, but it was beginning to take shape. Financing under my identity, Bright Current in the middle, Clear Harbor receiving value. I called Daniel Cross. I need you to look at an LLC. Public records? For now. I sent him the name. A few hours later, he called back. Lila Grant? You found her. Not difficult. She's connected to Clear Harbor all over the place. Publicly? Yes. Anything connecting Bright Current directly? Give me time. I already knew the next step could not be handled like a family dispute. The amount was too large, the account structure was too complicated, and if records were being moved through multiple entities, I needed legal advice before I went further. That was how I met Rebecca Sloan. Rebecca was a commercial litigation attorney with experience in financial fraud and business disputes. She had been recommended by a former North Star attorney who knew only that I had a personal identity theft matter involving business accounts. I brought Rebecca a clean chronology. Not the blue tin, not my childhood, not the brooch. The current case, the $184,000 guarantee, the identity variations, the disputed accounts totaling more than $327,000, the co-working records, the prepaid number, the equipment lease, Daniel's photographs, Bright Current. Rebecca read for almost 20 minutes without speaking. Then she looked at me. How much of this have you shown your sister? None. Your parents? Only a written warning about their investment. Have you threatened anyone? No. Posted anything publicly? No. Good. She closed the folder. Keep it that way. That was the first thing I liked about Rebecca. She didn't promise me justice in the first meeting. She didn't tell me I had already won. She told me where the case was strong and where it wasn't. "You have a documented identity theft problem," she said. "You have evidence of business benefit connected to one disputed lease. You have indicators of a financial pathway. But indicators are not the same as authenticated banking records." "I know." She looked at me. "Yes, I think you actually do." We spent the next hour discussing preservation. That became the immediate priority. If Bright Current and Clear Harbor were connected to disputed financing, relevant records needed to survive. Payment processor data, account communications, application records, electronic signature logs, business correspondence, storage and delivery records. Rebecca prepared preservation letters directed through the appropriate channels. She explained each one to me before it went out. "This isn't a public accusation," she said. "We're telling relevant parties that records connected to a dispute may be material and should not be destroyed." "Will Celeste know?" "Not necessarily from every recipient, but assume she may eventually learn there is a dispute." That was fine. I wasn't relying on secrecy forever. I was relying on order. Daniel's work on Bright Current came back 4 days later. The LLC used a commercial mailing address. Its public contact information overlapped with a vendor onboarding document from Clear Harbor. More importantly, Lila had represented Bright Current as a strategy consultant to Clear Harbor in at least one professional profile. Again, that didn't prove wrongdoing, but it established relationship. Rebecca requested that I stop conducting any direct outreach connected to Bright Current. "From here," she said, "you don't want to contaminate your own case." So I stopped. That was harder than I expected. For years, I had survived by finding things myself. Now I had to trust process. Rebecca handled legal strategy. Daniel handled lawful field verification. I maintained chronology and provided records I already possessed. The case became stronger because I stopped trying to control every part of it. Within weeks, additional information from the fraud dispute process clarified one of the payment pathways. A financing disbursement associated with an account opened under a variation of my name had been directed through an account connected to Bright Current. Later transactions showed payments moving from Bright Current toward Clear Harbor-related expenses and processor activity. I read the transfer summary 3 times. Then I called Rebecca. "This is the bridge?" "It may be one bridge," she corrected. I smiled despite myself. She was right. Never overstate the evidence. "So what does it prove?" "That depends on authentication and context. But it supports a pathway from disputed financing to an intermediary entity connected to Lila, then toward Clear Harbor." "Meaning Celeste benefited." "Meaning Clear Harbor appears to have benefited. Don't skip steps." I wrote that down. Not because I needed the reminder professionally, because personally, I wanted to skip every step. I wanted to call Diane and say, "This is what you defended." I wanted to call Russell and ask whether silence still felt neutral. I wanted to send Celeste the transfer pathway and ask her to explain it. I did none of those things. Instead, Rebecca and I reviewed the chronology. The structure was no longer random. My identity had been used across multiple financing products. Verification information included family-held personal data, application activity connected to locations used by Celeste or Clear Harbor. A prepaid phone number had documented historical use by Celeste. Equipment from a disputed lease was physically used by Clear Harbor. And now money from disputed financing appeared to move through Bright Current toward Clear Harbor-related activity. Rebecca leaned back. "Who is Lila to your sister?" "I don't know exactly." "Find out only through material you already have or public sources, no contact." I reviewed years of Clear Harbor's public content. Lila appeared more often than I had realized. She stood behind Celeste at early retreats. She coordinated vendor tables. She appeared in one video discussing operational growth. But something changed in the most recent posts. Lila was disappearing. Fewer tags, no recent speaking appearances, no mention in a new leadership announcement. I showed Rebecca. She studied the dates. could mean nothing. I know. But if she was involved in the money flow and is now being moved away from the company, she may be exposed. Rebecca nodded. Or blamed. That possibility stayed with me. Celeste had spent her entire life surviving problems by placing someone else at the center of them. First me, maybe now Lila. Daniel found another small but important detail. Bright Current had paid for several Clear Harbor operating expenses during a period when contractors had complained privately about late payments. That suggested the intermediary wasn't merely providing abstract consulting, it was helping keep the business running. The financial motive became clearer. Clear Harbor needed cash. Celeste needed expansion to continue. My parents' $210,000 had entered during the same broader period of financial pressure. The disputed financing provided another source of support, and the Savannah property gave Celeste a story about family asset backing. The pieces were different, but they served the same purpose. Keep Clear Harbor alive, keep investors confident, keep Celeste's public image intact. I asked Rebecca what would happen next. We preserve first, authenticate second, then decide where the evidence belongs. Civil court? Possibly. Criminal referral? Possibly. I hated that word. Possibly. But it was honest. Rebecca continued. You need to understand something. Once this moves beyond identity theft disputes and into coordinated movement of funds through business entities, the legal risk changes for everyone involved, including Lila. Especially Lila, if her company was used as the intermediary. That confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. Lila was not just a name on an LLC filing. She was the weak point, not because she was innocent. I didn't know that. Because unlike Diane and Russell, she wasn't protected by family loyalty. And unlike Celeste, she didn't own the public story. If pressure came, Lila had fewer reasons to sacrifice herself for Clear Harbor. Rebecca sent the final preservation notices that week. I kept copies of the correspondence and logged the dates. Records at multiple organizations were now formally identified for preservation. Celeste could delete a text from her phone. She could change a website. She could tell Diane a new version of events. But the case no longer lived in one place. That was the shift. For most of my life, Celeste had controlled stories by controlling the room. Now the relevant records were spread across lenders, processors, business filings, storage documentation, electronic systems, and legal correspondence. She didn't know all of that yet. And I finally understood that my greatest advantage wasn't having one devastating piece of evidence. It was having a process she couldn't intimidate. I left Rebecca's office carrying less paper than I had brought in. She had taken copies for the legal file. Daniel had his own documented work product. Third parties had preservation obligations. The evidence was no longer sitting on my dining table waiting for my family to argue about what it meant. It had moved beyond them. For the first time since the original loan email arrived, I didn't feel like I was defending myself. I was building a case. For years, I told myself my mother might have misunderstood Dr. Mercer. It was the last generous explanation I had left for her. Then Rebecca obtained the full report, and I saw Diane's signature beneath a warning she had spent more than 20 years pretending she had never received. The appointment card had been sitting in the blue tin since I was 13. By itself, it proved almost nothing. It showed that Dr. Helen Mercer had scheduled another appointment. It showed the date and office address. It supported my memory that treatment had not ended because I refused to participate. But it didn't prove what Dr. Mercer had told my parents. For that, we needed the record. I mentioned it to Rebecca during a chronology review. She stopped turning pages. You said there was a written report? Dr. Mercer told my parents her recommendation would be in one. Do you know if it still exists? No. How old were you? 13. Rebecca leaned back. Old records are difficult. Difficult isn't the same as impossible. I brought her the appointment card the next morning. It felt strange removing it from the tin. The paper had softened at the edges. Dr. Mercer's office number was printed in faded blue ink. On the back, someone at the office had written the next appointment time by hand. Rebecca held it carefully. This gives us a starting point. The original practice no longer operated under the same name. Dr. Mercer had retired years earlier. Records from the practice had gone through a succession of custodians after a merger with a behavioral health group. Rebecca handled the requests. I stayed out of it. That had become another form of discipline. Not every door needed me standing in front of it. Several weeks passed. Then Rebecca called. We found the custodian. My hand tightened around the phone. And? There are archived records associated with the practice. Mine? They haven't confirmed content yet. I closed my eyes. Okay. Don't build the conclusion before we have the document. I know. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. The formal process took longer than I wanted. Authorization issues had to be resolved. The custodian needed to verify what could be released and in what form. Rebecca wanted certification that would establish where the records came from. She didn't want loose photocopies. She wanted provenance. While we waited, I tried not to think about what the report might say. That was impossible. I remembered the hallway outside Dr. Mercer's office. I remembered the magazine open on my knees. I remembered hearing her say that she did not believe I was the source of the family dynamic. I remembered my mother accusing me of listening through the door. For 22 years, I had carried that conversation as memory. Now I was about to learn whether memory and record agreed. The packet arrived at Rebecca's office on a Thursday. She called me at 3:40. I have it. I left work at my normal time. I didn't rush. That surprised even me. When I arrived, Rebecca had placed the packet on the conference table. The certification page was on top. Below it was an intake form, my mother's handwriting, behavioral concerns following a family theft incident. I recognized the words immediately. I had read them upside down in the waiting room when I was 13. My throat tightened. Rebecca said, "Take your time." I turned the page. Dr. Mercer's notes were clinical and careful. She documented the family history as reported by Diane. She documented my responses. She noted that several allegations against me lacked specific examples when explored. Then I reached the section about the joint session. Celeste's reported fear was described as non-specific. Diane's repeated answering on Celeste's behalf was documented. So was my mother's tendency to interpret my requests for clarification as hostility. I stopped reading. For a moment, I could hear the rain machine from the old waiting room. Not literally, but the memory was that clear. I continued. The report did not say Celeste was evil. It did not diagnose her with anything. That mattered. Dr. Mercer had been careful. She recommended further individual assessment of Celeste because of inconsistencies in reported events, interpersonal dynamics between the sisters, and concerns that assigning the entire family's conflict to one child was clinically inappropriate. Then I reached the sentence that changed something permanent inside me. Morgan should not be treated as the identified patient for the broader family system. I read it again. Rebecca was silent. I kept going. Dr. Mercer recommended family therapy, separate assessment for Celeste, continued support for me, and a warning against reinforcing unverified accusations as evidence of pathology. I sat back. For more than 2 decades, Diane had told people that a specialist confirmed I had serious emotional problems related to jealousy of my sister. The actual report said almost the opposite. Still, some part of me searched for the generous explanation. Maybe Diane never received the report. Maybe it was mailed and lost. Maybe she had heard what she wanted during the meeting, but never read the final document. Then I turned the page. There was an acknowledgement form. Diane Hale, her signature, the date. The form stated that recommendations had been reviewed with the parent and that a copy of the written summary had been received. Below the signature was a handwritten note from Dr. Mercer. Mother disagrees with recommendation for broader family intervention and assessment of younger sibling. Risks of continuing to frame Morgan as sole source of conflict discussed. I stopped breathing normally. Rebecca said my name quietly. I didn't answer. I looked at the signature again. I knew that signature. I had seen it on birthday cards, school permission slips, checks, letters. There was no question whose hand had made it. My mother knew. Not everything. Not what Celeste would become. Not what would happen 20 years later. But she knew that Dr. Mercer had rejected the story she kept telling. She knew the professional recommendation was not to isolate me as the problem. She knew Celeste needed further assessment, and she went home and told everyone the opposite. I had expected anger. What I felt was grief. Anger still contains an argument. Grief begins when the argument is over. Rebecca gave me a few minutes alone. I sat in that conference room, staring at a signature that had been waiting in an archive while my mother rewrote my childhood. Suddenly, small memories changed shape. Diane telling relatives that I had refused treatment. False. Diane saying the therapist had been worried about my jealousy. False. Diane using the phrase professional help whenever she needed to make me sound dangerous. Not misunderstanding. Choice. When Rebecca returned, she sat across from me. I need to ask what you want to do with this. Legally? Legally and strategically. I looked at the report. I don't know. That is an acceptable answer. Can she deny it? People can deny anything. The signature? She can dispute authenticity if she wants, but we have a certified record from the custodian. There are procedures for handling that. I nodded. Then I asked, does this help the financial case? Indirectly. How? If your family later relies on a history of instability to attack your credibility, this record may become important. I thought about Celeste's brand, the videos, the interviews, Diane speaking publicly about protecting one daughter from another. The report didn't prove the financing fraud. It did something different. It attacked the foundation of the story that made fraud against me easier to explain away. That distinction mattered. Rebecca told me not to contact Diane. I agreed. This time, I didn't even want to. There was nothing I needed her to explain. The document had already answered the question that mattered. Did you know? Yes. I went home late. For the first time in years, I took everything out of the blue tin. The high school email metadata, the forged apartment lease, collection letters, old notes, Noah's message, and the appointment card. I placed the card beside the certified copy of Dr. Mercer's report. The chain was simple: appointment card, archived practice, record custodian, certified report, Diane's acknowledgement. A small piece of cardboard I had saved at 13 had led to a document I could never have obtained through memory alone. That was the first time the tin gave something back to me. Not revenge, not victory, truth. But truth can hurt differently when it arrives too late to repair what was taken. I thought about every family gathering where I had been watched, every disagreement where my anger had been treated as evidence, every time Russell had told me to let something go. Diane had possessed information that could have changed the way our family understood me. She buried it because the alternative required confronting Celeste and herself. I didn't sleep much that night. By morning, I had made one decision. I would not use the report to humiliate my mother privately. I would not send it to relatives. I would not post it online. The document would stay with Rebecca as part of the legal file. If Diane never used the old story against me again, the report might never need to leave that file. That was the choice I made. It was not the choice my mother would make. A few weeks later, Noah called and told me Celeste had been asking questions about my work at North Star. Not casual questions, questions about access, authority, what systems I could see, whether I could obtain private financial information through my job. I asked, why? I don't know yet, but I understood the direction. Celeste knew I had asked questions about Clear Harbor. She knew I had warned our parents. She didn't know what evidence I had, so she was beginning to build an explanation for how I might have obtained it. I told Rebecca. She listened carefully. Then she said, "Document that conversation. Nothing else." I did. That evening, I looked once more at Diane's signed acknowledgement. For years, I had believed the worst thing my mother did was refuse to believe me. I had been wrong. She had believed enough of the truth to know it was dangerous. Then she chose the lie anyway. I scanned the appointment card for the legal file, returned the original to the blue tin, and closed the lid. The card had done its job. It had survived long enough to lead me back to the truth. Now the truth had a signature. Celeste had spent years telling people I was unstable. Now she needed that story to do something more useful. She needed lenders, lawyers, and my employer to believe that any evidence against Clear Harbor had been created by a jealous sister with improper access to corporate systems. So before the financial trail could close around her, Celeste filed first. Noah called me 3 days after I learned she had been asking questions about my job. I have the decks. I was in my car outside North Star. What decks? The investor presentations. I didn't ask him to email them. Where did you get them? 2 investors received them directly from Clear Harbor. They know there's a dispute now, and they agreed to provide copies through counsel. Send them to Rebecca. Already did. That was one reason I trusted Noah. He had learned the same lesson I had. Source mattered. By the time I reached Rebecca's office that evening, she had already reviewed the first presentation. There were 3 versions. One was designed for early investors. Another was used for larger funding conversations. The third appeared to be a private expansion deck. The numbers changed between versions. So did the language about Savannah. Rebecca turned her laptop toward me. A slide titled Long-Term Asset Stability showed a photograph of the commercial building, my grandmother's building. Underneath it, the presentation referred to founder family commercial real estate interests supporting Clear Harbor's long-term expansion strategy. I read the sentence twice. That's false. Rebecca looked at me. Explain precisely. Celeste has no ownership interest. Diane has no authority over the trust. Russell has none. Clear Harbor has no claim on that property. And you? I hesitated. Rebecca knew I had a trust relationship, but not every administrative detail. I am the successor trustee under the controlling documents. She was silent for a moment. Does Celeste know? No. Your mother? No. Who does? Trust counsel. The professional administrator. Me. Margaret knew before she died. Rebecca leaned back. So Celeste represented a family asset as financial support without knowing who legally controls it. Yes. Do the trust documents allow the property to support Clear Harbor? No. Has any authorization been issued? No. She nodded once. That matters. I looked through the other decks. The language became more aggressive in later versions. One referred to access to established family commercial holdings. Another described the Savannah property as part of a long-term asset base available to support expansion. Available. That word made me angry. Not because Celeste had insulted me, because she was promising access to something Margaret had specifically structured to protect. Rebecca asked whether I had ever given Celeste reason to believe she had an interest. No. Did your mother? She talked about the building as a family asset, legally irrelevant, but useful for understanding what Celeste may claim she believed. That was Rebecca. She never let the evidence become simpler than it was. The investor decks were important, but they also created a new problem. If lenders were asking about the asset claims, Celeste would know pressure was building, and pressured people moved. 2 days later, one of the financing companies contacted me again. Their fraud team wanted additional information about the disputed guarantee. I provided what Rebecca approved, nothing more. The following Monday, I was called into a conference room at North Star. Karen Willis was there. So was someone from Human Resources and an attorney from Corporate Legal. I knew immediately that the meeting wasn't routine. Karen spoke first. Morgan, we received a formal complaint. My stomach tightened. From whom? The attorney answered. A business owner who alleges that you used your position here to obtain confidential financial information for a personal dispute. I didn't move. Celeste Hale? He didn't confirm the name immediately. He didn't need to. The complaint accused me of accessing restricted databases, using professional relationships to gather private business information, and targeting Clear Harbor because of a long history of family hostility. The phrase family hostility was repeated several times. I listened without interrupting. Then the attorney placed a copy of the complaint in front of me. Attached to it were supporting statements, one from Diane, one from Russell. My parents had put the family story into sworn affidavits. Diane described me as emotionally unstable, fixated on Celeste, and unable to accept her sister's success. Russell's statement was shorter. That hurt more. He wrote that the family had experienced concerns about my behavior since adolescence, and that professional intervention had once been necessary. Professional intervention. Again. The same phrase, only now it wasn't marketing language, it was in an affidavit. Karen looked at me. "Morgan, is there anything you want to say before we continue?" Every instinct in my body wanted to open my bag. I wanted to show them the full Dr. Mercer report. I wanted to explain Bright Current, the equipment lease, the co-working records, the identity theft disputes. I wanted to prove everything at once. Then I remembered Rebecca's instructions. Do not improvise when the other side forces the timing. I looked at the attorney. I deny accessing any North Star system for a personal purpose. Can you explain how you obtained the financial information referenced in the complaint? I can provide a response through counsel with documentation showing the lawful sources of the records I possess. The HR representative asked, "Are you refusing to answer?" "No, I'm asking to respond accurately." Karen watched me carefully. She knew me well enough to understand what that meant. The corporate attorney said North Star had an obligation to investigate. I agreed. Then he told me my access to certain systems would be suspended temporarily. The words were professional. The effect was not. My badge would still get me into the building, but I was being removed from active investigations while the complaint was reviewed. I had spent years building a career around evidence. Now my sister had used the story of my instability to put that career at risk. I signed the acknowledgement confirming receipt of the administrative action. I did not argue. When I left the room, Karen followed me into the hallway. Quietly, she said, "Morgan." I stopped. "Follow the process." I almost smiled. She had no idea how familiar those words were. "I will." I called Rebecca from the parking garage. She listened. Then she asked one question. "Did you disclose anything beyond the denial?" "No." "Good. My parents signed affidavits." "I know." "How?" "The complaint was copied to counsel after you authorized representation on the related disputes." I closed my eyes. "Rebecca, my father signed one." "I know." For a moment, I couldn't speak. Celeste filing against me was escalation. Diane joining her was predictable. Russell signing a sworn statement was different. Silence had always been his preferred form of betrayal. Now he had signed his name. Rebecca told me to come to her office. When I arrived, she had the complaint materials organized. "There's something you need to see?" She placed Diane's affidavit beside an exhibit Celeste had attached. It was a portion of Dr. Mercer's report. My body went cold. At first glance, it looked legitimate. The letterhead matched. The formatting matched. The text came from the real report, but pages were missing. The attached version included references to family conflict and my emotional responses. It omitted the recommendation that I should not be treated as the identified patient. It omitted the recommendation for Celeste's evaluation. It omitted the warning against reinforcing unverified accusations. And it omitted Diane's signed acknowledgement. I looked at Rebecca. She cropped the report. More accurately, someone submitted an incomplete excerpt in a way that creates a misleading impression. Celeste had this? That's a question we need answered. I read the exhibit again. The complaint described the excerpt as documentation of long-standing concerns about my behavior. That was not what the full report said. The false narrative had entered a new phase. It was no longer just being repeated. It was being supported with selectively altered context. Rebecca placed the certified full report beside the excerpt. The contrast was devastating. "Do we send this to North Star now?" "Yes, through the proper response, but carefully." Why carefully? Because this complaint may have implications beyond your employment review. If someone knowingly submitted misleading material in connection with a formal allegation, we document that before we start making accusations about intent. I nodded. I knew she was right. Still, sitting there felt like being 13 again. Only this time, the brooch wasn't in my coat pocket. It was attached as Exhibit C. Rebecca saw my expression. Don't confuse being attacked with losing. I looked at her. I'm suspended from my work. Temporarily restricted pending review. My parents signed statements against me. Yes. My sister filed first. Yes. She leaned forward. And now she has committed herself to a version of events in writing. That changed the way I saw the complaint. For most of our lives, Celeste's advantage had been flexibility. She could adjust the story. Diane could reinterpret what she meant. Russell could claim he hadn't heard enough to know. Now they had filed documents, dates, claims, signatures, affidavits, exhibits. They had finally done what I had spent years waiting for. They had written the lie down. Over the next several days, Rebecca prepared my response to North Star. We documented the lawful source of each category of information. Records from my own identity theft disputes, public business filings, public marketing material, documents provided voluntarily through counsel, Daniel's licensed investigative work. No North Star confidential database had been used. My employer's technical audit would be able to verify that independently. That was the part Celeste had not understood. She thought my job gave me secret access to everything. In reality, North Star logged system activity precisely because compliance work required accountability. My professional audit trail could protect me. The same controls Celeste imagined I had abused were capable of showing that I hadn't. I returned home one evening and found 3 missed calls from Diane. I didn't return them. Then she sent a message. You have taken this too far. I read it once. For years I had wondered what too far meant in my family. Apparently, stealing my identity wasn't too far. Using false financial obligations wasn't too far. Promising access to property Celeste didn't control wasn't too far, but asking questions was. I forwarded the message to Rebecca and added it to the chronology. No reply. That became my rule. Celeste had filed first because she believed forcing me into a defensive position would make me panic. She believed I would call everyone. Argue, cry, threaten, give her something she could use. Instead, I went quiet. Not the silence Russell used to avoid responsibility. A different kind. Strategic silence. The investigators working through the financial disputes continued their review. Rebecca continued preserving records. North Star continued its internal audit. I went to work each morning and performed the limited duties I was permitted to perform. People noticed. Of course they did. I didn't explain. That was one of the hardest things I had ever done. My entire life, I had wanted someone to ask me what really happened. Now people might have been asking, and I had to wait until the evidence could answer properly. Noah called one night. I'm sorry. For what? The Dex started this. No, Celeste started this. She knows investors are asking questions. Good. She thinks you're behind everything. I know. What are you going to do? Nothing tonight. He laughed softly. That would drive your family crazy. This isn't about driving them crazy. I know. After we hung up, I opened the investor decks again. Savannah, the photograph of Margaret's building, the language about family assets. Celeste had put the property into a financial presentation because she believed nobody in the family would challenge her. Then, when questions started, she filed a complaint portraying me as unstable and professionally unethical. The logic was becoming visible. Investor questions threatened the asset claim. The asset claim threatened fundraising. The financing trail threatened Clear Harbor. So Celeste attacked the credibility of the person closest to the records. Me. For the first time, I could see exactly why she needed the old family story. It wasn't history anymore. It was legal strategy. A week after the complaint, Rebecca called me into her office again. She had placed 4 documents across the conference table: the investor deck, Celeste's complaint, Diane's affidavit, the cropped Mercer report. She pointed to them in order. Asset representation creates pressure. Her finger moved. Pressure creates motive to discredit you. Then Diane's affidavit. Family history supports the attack. Finally, the cropped report. And selective documentation gives the story the appearance of professional support. I looked at the 4 documents. There it was. A chain. Not the financial chain. A second one. The chain of the attack against me. Celeste thought filing first would stop the investigation. Instead, she had documented her own escalation. I left Rebecca's office without feeling victorious. My access at North Star was still restricted. My reputation was still under review. My parents had chosen Celeste publicly and legally. Those facts hurt. But I wasn't 13 anymore. This time I understood the difference between being accused and being defeated. An accusation was a claim. A report was a record. An affidavit was a commitment. And a cropped document could always be placed beside the complete one. For most of my life, my family had survived by keeping everything verbal. Now they had entered my world. Dates, documents, signatures, audit trails. They thought they had finally found a way to silence me. What they had actually done was create more evidence. Celeste had spent years creating people she could blame. I had been the first. Lila Grant was supposed to be the next. What Celeste did not understand was that once Lila realized where the story was heading, she stopped protecting Clear Harbor and started protecting herself. The weeks after Celeste filed the complaint were strangely quiet. Publicly, Clear Harbor kept operating. Celeste announced the Renewal Summit in Atlanta, a major event built around the theme of reclaiming your story. The promotional videos showed her walking through the venue, smiling beside sponsors, and talking about truth. I watched one video without sound. Then I sent the link to Rebecca. Relevant? I asked. Potentially. That was all she said. Behind the public image, the case was moving faster. The financial investigators had finished verifying the metadata connected to several disputed applications. The dates matched the chronology I had built, but now the information came through authenticated records instead of my own analysis. The co-working check-in records were also verified. On one application date, Celeste had personally entered the facility before the account activity occurred and left afterward. On another, the reserved workspace was tied to Clear Harbor staff. That still did not prove whose fingers touched the keyboard, but it narrowed the possibilities. The prepaid number connection was strengthened by additional records showing repeated use in Clear Harbor-related vendor communications during the same general period. Then came the document examiner's report. Rebecca called me into her office. A forensic document examiner had compared signatures from several disputed applications with known signature samples obtained through appropriate channels. The conclusion was carefully worded. Certain signatures attributed to me showed significant indications of simulation and were inconsistent with my known writing habits. The examiner did not identify the person who had signed them. That wasn't the assignment. But the report established something important. The signatures weren't merely ones I claimed not to recognize. There was professional analysis supporting forgery. Rebecca placed the report in the growing legal file. Another independent source, she said. That had become the strength of the case. No single piece carried everything. Metadata established timing. Check-in logs established location. Phone records established use. Financial records established movement. Physical verification established business benefit. Document analysis established forgery indicators. Different systems, different custodians, the same direction. Then Bright Current became the center of the investigation. Lila received a subpoena. I did not know the exact day it happened. Rebecca told me only after Lila had retained counsel and communications began through attorneys. Is she cooperating? I asked. She is responding through counsel. That isn't what I asked. Rebecca gave me a look. Then ask a question I'm allowed to answer. I almost smiled. Is she still protecting Celeste? Rebecca paused. not in the way Celeste expected. That was enough. The first useful material from Lila's side came through document production: emails, transfer notes, internal messages, bright current invoices. At first, the records made Lila look terrible. Her LLC had received money connected to financing I disputed. Bright Current had paid Clear Harbor expenses. Lila had participated in transfers between accounts. I asked Rebecca the obvious question: why would she give this up? Because the records already exist elsewhere. I understood immediately. Bank records, processor records, financing records, preservation notices. Lila could not make the transactions disappear. Her only remaining decision was whether to explain them before Celeste explained them for her. And Celeste had already started. Lila's attorney provided an email exchange that changed the dynamic. In the message, Celeste asked Lila to organize records showing that Bright Current had independently arranged several financing transactions and then provided strategic support to Clear Harbor. The dates bothered me. The email had been sent after lenders began asking questions. I read the wording again: independently arranged, strategic support. The language seemed designed to separate Celeste from the source of the money. Another message was worse. Celeste wrote that Lila had always handled financing logistics and should be prepared to explain her decisions if questions arose. Lila's response was short: those applications were not my decisions. Celeste did not answer in writing. I looked at Rebecca. She was setting her up. That's one interpretation. What's yours? My interpretation is that Lila's attorney noticed the same thing. The next production included transfer notes. Several payments from Bright Current to Clear Harbor were labeled consulting support or event operations, but Lila's internal notes identified some of them differently. Bridge payment for studio rent, retreat equipment shortfall, certification launch expenses. Clear Harbor had not been receiving ordinary consulting services. Bright Current had been functioning as a financial bridge, and at least some of the money feeding that bridge traced back to financing opened through my identity. The case had reached the point where I no longer needed to imagine the structure. I could draw it. Disputed financing, Bright Current, Clear Harbor operating expenses, expansion, investor claims, family money. Every path led toward keeping Celeste's company alive. Then Rebecca called me one evening and asked me to come in the next morning. When I arrived, Daniel was already there. So was another attorney from Rebecca's firm. A small audio file sat open on a laptop. Rebecca said, "This was produced through Lila's counsel. We are still handling authentication, so do not discuss it with anyone." "What is it?" "A voice message Celeste sent to Lila." My stomach tightened. Rebecca pressed play. Celeste's voice filled the room. She sounded irritated, not frightened. She said Lila needed to stop panicking. She said Morgan would complain, but nobody would take it seriously because the family already knew Morgan was unstable. Then she said something I had to hear twice. She keeps records because she's not normal. That's exactly why nobody believes her. The message continued. Celeste said I had spent my whole life trying to prove people wrong, and that if I raised questions about financing, it could be framed as another obsession. Then came the sentence that changed the room. "Use Morgan where you need to. Mom will back us up." The recording ended. Nobody spoke. I looked at Rebecca. What does she mean by use me? We don't assume beyond the context we can establish. But she knew. She appears to understand that your identity or position could be used while your credibility could be attacked. We need the surrounding communications. I stood and walked to the window. For years I had believed Celeste used the family story because it was convenient. The voice message suggested something colder. She understood the story had practical value. If I complained, I was obsessed. If I noticed patterns, I was unstable. If I kept records, that itself could be described as abnormal. The very habits I had developed to survive her lies were supposed to become proof that I was lying. I expected to feel rage. Instead, I felt clear. Pain had become information. That was new. I returned to the table. What happens now? Rebecca closed the laptop. Now we authenticate everything. Lila's counsel continues cooperating. Investigators compare her account against independent records. And Celeste? She knows Lila has counsel. She does not know everything Lila has provided. Good. Rebecca looked at me. This is not a game, Morgan. I know. Then understand what comes next. There are now multiple groups with different interests. Lenders, investors, your employer, potential authorities, trust administration. We coordinate. We do not improvise. I nodded. The trust administration entered the picture formally 2 days later. A group of Clear Harbor investors sent a written demand seeking verification of the Savannah asset representations. The demand referenced the commercial property directly. They wanted proof of ownership, proof of available collateral, proof that Clear Harbor, or Celeste, had legal access to the asset represented in fundraising materials. Rebecca forwarded the demand to Samuel Price and the professional fiduciary administrator. For the first time, the two halves of my hidden advantage came together. My professional ability had helped me understand the evidence. My legal authority under the trust would answer the asset claim. Samuel called me. Did you authorize any representation that the property supports Clear Harbor? No. Any collateral commitment? No. Any letter of support? No. Any permission for Celeste to represent access to trust property? No. He paused. Then our response will be straightforward. I asked whether my name needed to be disclosed immediately. Not beyond what is legally necessary at this stage. The trust can deny the claimed access through counsel and administration. That mattered. Celeste still did not understand the structure she had been using in presentations. She knew investors were asking. She knew someone was challenging the claim. But she still believed the building belonged to a vague category called family property. There was no such category in law. There were documents, trust terms, authority, restrictions. Celeste had built confidence on assumptions. Now those assumptions were meeting records. The investor group did something Rebecca had anticipated. They requested that the issue be addressed before or during the renewal summit because several sponsors and potential investors were expected to attend. I didn't like that. I don't want a stunt. Neither do I, Rebecca said. I mean it. I'm not walking onto a stage to surprise my sister. Good, because that would be stupid. I looked at her. She continued. The investors have their own rights. Trust Council has its own obligations. If Celeste makes false representations in a public investor setting after receiving demands for verification, that's her decision. So we wait. We prepare. That word felt different now. Not passive, not afraid, prepared. Noah agreed to authenticate how the investor decks had been distributed and to identify the people who had received them directly. Lila's attorney continued producing records. Daniel finalized his physical verification report. The forensic document examiner completed the signature analysis. Rebecca organized the lawful source history for every major record. Samuel prepared certified trust documentation. The professional administrator prepared confirmation that no authorization had ever been given to Clear Harbor. None of us were doing the same job. That was why it worked. For most of my life, I had tried to carry the truth alone. Now the truth had witnesses, it had custodians, it had attorneys, it had financial records, it had a trustee structure, it had people whose credibility did not depend on whether Diane thought I was difficult. North Star's review was also moving. Their technical audit found no evidence that I had accessed company systems for the personal investigation. I was told the review was not yet formally closed, but I was no longer the central concern. That news should have made me celebrate. It didn't. I had become cautious about relief. Instead, I asked for the finding in writing when the review concluded. Karen nodded. Of course you did. This time she smiled. The week before the summit, Rebecca and I reviewed the full chronology. Not every record would be used publicly. That was important. Public accountability was not the same as dumping every private detail into a room. The Savannah claim required trust records. The investor representations required the decks and recipients. The money pathway required authenticated financial material and Lila's cooperation. The family narrative, if Diane or Celeste used it to attack my credibility, could be answered with the complete Mercer report. Each fact had a purpose. Each document had a source. Each witness had a role. I asked Rebecca, what if Celeste backs down? Then some issues may be resolved through formal channels without a public confrontation. And if she doesn't? Rebecca closed the binder. Then the records remain the records. That was the difference between us. Celeste needed a room to believe her. I didn't. The night before I left for Atlanta, I opened the blue tin. I didn't remove anything. I just looked inside. At 13, I had saved an appointment card because I was afraid the truth would disappear. Now the evidence existed in places I could not control and Celeste could not erase. That should have frightened me. Instead, it gave me peace. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for my family to decide whether I was believable. Their decision no longer controlled the outcome. Celeste had tried to create another person to carry the blame. Instead, she had created a witness, and by turning her business, her investors, my employer, and the trust into separate battlegrounds, she had made the same mistake in every one of them. She assumed she was still controlling one family story. She wasn't. She was answering to records now. Celeste built the Renewal Summit around one promise: the truth will set you free. More than 600 people came to Atlanta to hear her talk about survival, boundaries, and reclaiming your story. By the end of the afternoon, the story she had sold for years was still on the giant screens behind her. The difference was that the documents were finally in the room, too. I arrived with Rebecca. We did not sit near the stage. Noah was several rows away with 2 members of the investor group. Trust counsel and a representative of the fiduciary administrator were seated near the side aisle. Lila was not there. Her attorney was. That mattered more. The first half of the summit went exactly as Celeste planned. Music, applause, testimonials. A video montage of women talking about rebuilding their lives after toxic relationships. Then Celeste walked onto the stage. She was good. I had forgotten how good. She knew when to lower her voice, when to pause, when to smile through something painful. Eventually, she began talking about childhood. She never said my name. She didn't have to. My first bully lived in my own home. The room became quiet. She described an older sister who monitored her, resented her, and tried to destroy every good thing that happened to her. I listened. No reaction. Then Celeste said that when Clear Harbor began succeeding, the same person had tried to interfere again. That was new. Rebecca wrote something on her legal pad. Celeste continued. She described false accusations, harassment, an attempt to undermine the company. Then Diane joined her on stage. My mother looked smaller under the lights. Celeste took her hand. Diane told the audience that parents sometimes had to accept painful truths about their children. Then she said, "We sought professional help when Morgan was young." My name. Rebecca looked at me. I nodded once. The choice had been Diane's. The full report was now relevant. After lunch came the investor session. It was presented as an open discussion about Clear Harbor's expansion. The first questions were easy. Projected growth, certification programs, new markets. Then a man from the investor group stood. "Can you clarify the company's access to the Savannah commercial property referenced in investment materials?" The room changed. Not dramatically, just enough. Celeste smiled. "That property is part of long-term family holdings connected to our expansion stability." The investor remained standing. "Is it owned by Clear Harbor?" "No, it is a family asset." "Has it been pledged as collateral?" Celeste hesitated. "The structure is more complicated than that." The investor looked toward Rebecca. Rebecca stood. "My firm represents Morgan Hale in related matters. Counsel for the trust and its administrator are present. Certified records confirm that Clear Harbor has no ownership interest, collateral rights, or authorization to represent access to the property." A low murmur moved through the room. Celeste stared at her, then at me. "This is exactly what I was talking about," she said into the microphone. "My sister has spent years trying to interfere with my life." Rebecca didn't respond emotionally. She handed certified copies to the event council and investor representatives. Trust council stood next. "The property is governed by a trust structure. No authorization has been issued allowing Ms. Celeste Hale, Clear Harbor Collective, or Diane and Russell Hale to use the property as financial backing." Celeste's face changed, only slightly, but I saw it. She still didn't understand. The investor asked, "Then who has authority?" Rebecca looked at me. I stood. My legs were steady. "I am the successor trustee under the controlling documents." Silence. Not movie silence, real silence. Chairs moved. Someone coughed. A camera shutter clicked. Celeste stared at me as if I had spoken another language. Diane stepped toward the edge of the stage. "That isn't possible," Trust Council answered her. "It is documented." County filings and certified trust records were made available to the appropriate parties, not projected on screens, not waved around for drama. Verified. That was enough. Then Noah stood. He confirmed that the investment decks being reviewed were the versions distributed to investors and potential investors. The original files contained the Savannah asset representations. Celeste tried to interrupt. "These were planning documents." One investor answered, "They were fundraising documents." Another asked about Bright Current. Celeste said it was an outside strategy vendor. Lila's attorney stood. He read from a prepared statement authorized by his client. Bright Current had received funds associated with financing, now disputed as fraudulent. Funds had then been transferred toward Clear Harbor operating expenses. Lila was cooperating through counsel and had provided records, communications, and transaction information to the appropriate parties. Celeste stopped smiling. She said, "Lila handled those decisions independently." Her attorney looked down at his papers. Then he said, "Ms. Grant disputes that characterization." Rebecca did not play the voice memo. She didn't need to. The statement established cooperation. The financial records would be handled where they belonged. Celeste looked toward Diane. My mother stepped forward. "This is what Morgan does. She creates files. She collects things. A doctor warned us about this when she was a child." Rebecca opened the certified Mercer report. I felt something inside me become very still. "My client has authorized limited use of the relevant portions because Ms. Diane Hale has raised the issue publicly." Rebecca read the conclusion. Morgan should not be treated as the identified patient for the broader family system. Then the recommendation for Celeste's separate evaluation. Then the warning against reinforcing unverified accusations. Diane shook her head. "No, that isn't what we were told." Rebecca produced the acknowledgement page. "You signed receipt of the recommendations." My mother said nothing. Rebecca continued. "The record also notes that the recommendations and risks were discussed with you." Diane looked at the floor. That moment hurt more than anything Celeste had said. Not because I needed my mother humiliated. I didn't. Because after 22 years, she finally had no version left. The summit organizers called a break. Nobody moved. Investors were talking to counsel. Sponsors were gathering near the exits. Attendees were checking their phones. A journalist who had been covering the wellness industry approached one of the investor representatives. Celeste was still on stage. 600 people had come to hear her explain how truth survives manipulation. Now she stood beneath her own slogan while attorneys compared her claims to records. She looked at me. "You planned this?" I answered from the aisle. "No, you scheduled the summit." That was the only exchange we had. There was nothing else to argue about. The event ended early. Clear Harbor announced that the remaining sessions were postponed due to an urgent internal matter. By evening, sponsors had begun removing their names from promotional pages. Investors issued formal notices through counsel. Customers asked whether certification programs would continue. Media requests went to Clear Harbor, the investor group, and attorneys. I gave no interview. Neither did Rebecca. We left through a side exit. Outside, Atlanta traffic moved like nothing had happened. I stood beside Rebecca while we waited for the car. I had imagined this moment before. Not the summit. The feeling after being believed. I thought it would feel like winning. It didn't. It felt quiet. The trust records had answered the property claim. The decks had answered how the claim was used. Lila's statement had confirmed the financial bridge. The Mercer report had answered the story my mother told from the stage. Nothing had depended on me shouting louder than Celeste. That was the freedom in it. For years, my family had treated truth as a vote. Who believed Morgan? Who believed Celeste? Who agreed with Diane? At the renewal summit, belief became irrelevant. There were documents, there were witnesses, there were signatures, there were records held by people outside my family. Celeste had built a business around controlling the story. She lost control in the one place she believed belonged completely to her. Not because I took the microphone, because she did. And this time, the truth was already waiting for her to speak. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They came as notices, frozen accounts, canceled contracts, legal claims, and quiet admissions from people who had spent years refusing to admit anything. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to make any of it happen. I only had to decide whether I would rescue them from it. Clear Harbor lost its major sponsors within weeks of the summit. Payment processors froze accounts under review. Investor claims were filed. The company's remaining retreats were canceled, and customers began demanding refunds. Bright Current shut down. Lila continued cooperating through counsel. Celeste faced investigations involving identity theft, fraudulent electronic transfers, forged signatures, and the complaint she had filed against me. Rebecca warned me not to treat allegations as convictions. I didn't. I had learned to respect the difference between evidence and outcome. Clear Harbor's assets were eventually liquidated. The equipment Daniel had photographed in Colombia was among them. Celeste sold her house near Lake Norman as legal expenses and financial claims grew. My parents lost most of the $210,000 they had invested. Then Diane called me. I didn't answer. She sent a letter instead. I left it unopened for 3 days. When I finally read it, there was no dramatic apology. My mother still explained too much. She wrote about pressure, fear, and wanting to believe Celeste, but one sentence was different. I knew for a long time that parts of the story did not make sense, and I chose not to look harder. I read that sentence twice. Years earlier, I would have saved the letter in 3 places. Instead, I folded it once and put it in a drawer. Russell left me a voicemail. His voice sounded older. I should have asked more questions, Morgan. I kept thinking staying quiet meant I wasn't choosing sides. I was wrong. I kept the voicemail for 1 week. Then I deleted it. That surprised me more than anything else. I didn't need to preserve his confession. There was no hearing coming. No family dinner where I needed to prove what he had said. He knew. I knew. That was enough. My credit records were corrected over time. The fraudulent obligations were removed through the formal dispute processes and supporting investigations. North Star completed its internal review and restored my access. The letter confirming my full reinstatement was only 1 page. I read it once. Karen welcomed me back to active investigations without making a speech. You ready? Yes, and I was, but I also knew I didn't want to stay in Charlotte forever. The city had become a map of things I had survived. So I made changes slowly. I arranged for more of the Savannah Trust's daily administration to remain with professional management. I kept the responsibilities required of me, but I stopped treating control as something I had to hold personally every minute. Margaret had trusted me to protect the asset. Protecting it did not mean building my life around it. I left North Star on good terms several months later. Then I moved to Asheville and opened a small compliance and ethics consulting practice. The work was quieter. Smaller companies, nonprofits, healthcare groups that needed someone to build systems before problems became investigations. For the first time, my ability to notice patterns didn't feel like armor. It was simply work I was good at. Before leaving Charlotte, I opened the blue tin one final time. There were years inside it. The email metadata, the forged lease, collection letters, old notes, Noah's message, and the appointment card from Dr. Mercer. I didn't destroy anything. That would have felt too much like pretending none of it mattered. But I didn't take the whole tin with me either. The legal records were already where they belonged. The cases had their files. The trust had its administrators. The truth no longer depended on a metal box in my closet. I took only the appointment card, not as evidence, as a reminder. I placed it in the glove compartment of my car. Then I drove west. The mountains appeared gradually. For most of my life, I had believed safety meant keeping everything. Every message, every receipt, every document, every small piece of proof that could save me if someone decided to rewrite what happened. I don't believe that anymore. Some things should be preserved. Some things should be answered. And some things can be left behind once they have told the truth. The appointment card stayed in my glove compartment as I drove into Asheville. I didn't need to look at it. I already knew what it had led me back to. My own life. And this time, I wasn't keeping a record of where I was going.